Well, hello everyone. I think we will begin shortly. We forgot about half of people are logged in that we're expecting to attend today. Blair, if you could begin recording the session so that we can post that later, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's going, Norm.
Okay, let's get started, everyone. Thank you for your time and showing up for today. The topic for today is, as you know, is weld management, ShipConstructor weld management. So today we'll be covering, this is part of a technical series that we've been conducting for the last several months, and we will continue to provide these types of presentations in 2015. Basically, the format is it's really oriented towards users. The idea is to raise your awareness of these products and perhaps help you with them if you're already using them, so you can ask questions. Basically, I'll provide a brief product introduction just to set the stage, and then we'll dive into product demonstration. Today's presentation will be extensively focused on the demonstration. There's a lot to show in our weld management product. We do encourage you to ask questions, but we would prefer that you do them using the question pane and your go-to webinar thing. We'll be monitoring the queue as we go along. We will try to respond to your questions in real time as much as we can. We have people behind the scenes watching for the questions. Please try to stay on the current topic. Of course, there's always opportunity to ask us questions after the session as well. I encourage you to go to the Algae Marine Forum. I'll remind you of this at the end of the session, as well as if you are a ShipConstructor subscriber, you can provide questions through your Nexus account and client care account. My name is Norman Eldridge. I'm the Senior Product Manager here at SSI. And today's product demonstration will be by Blair Johnson. He's our Technical Product Manager, former developer lead, so he's intimately familiar with the software behind the scenes. Dennis Moray, our CTO, will be available as well for answering questions and answers. And Simon Gee, our lead software developer, our Team CI lead presently, was also available. So we have a number of people behind the scenes that should be able to answer your questions. Again, if we can't answer them in real time during the session, we'll be happy to follow it up afterwards. So let's begin. So when we started looking at this product, one of the first things we want to do is, well, what are people doing today? How do clients manage their welds today? And in order to answer this, we talked to a lot of our clients, read a lot of literature, trying to understand the situation. What turns out breaks down into a number of phases from beginning to end, beginning from setup through to warranty and traceability. Our product really does cover most of all of these aspects in various ways. So we are looking for that kind of a thing. And what do I mean by that? Weld management and shipbuilding. It's more than just the engineering. It's definitely the setting up of everything, defining your project weld standards, your welding rules. Of course, then you get into your detail modeling, weld path generation, assigning the weld standards to the welds, your production planning, optimize your build strategy, resource planning, watching out for your costs, all this type of stuff. Of course, there's a lot of production documentation, your weld labels, bill of materials. Throughout the whole process, really, there's the progress reports, various reports of how things are going in terms of design and modeling, as well as when we get into actually looking at the traceability, inspection, testing the requirements, making sure everything's up. And finally, traceability. If there's a failed weld, clients want to be able to trace it right back to, well, when did that happen and where and how. So that's the generic weld management and shipbuilding situation. When we set out to build our product, we wanted to create, we had a few goals to complement those, the mission, if you will. Integrated environment where all the information is leveraged and reused. Very intuitive, immersive, and highly visual environment. As you know, ShipConstructor is very visual, and so of course we wanted to take advantage of those aspects, right from entering data through to modeling, verifying welds, and managing the welds. So WeldManagement is a production and management system for structural welds in ShipConstructor. Now this product provides the ability to fully customize weld symbols and standards, and we'll see some of that today, all of that. It'll also provide the ability to develop a weld schedule for each particular project. Once welds have been defined in the project, including automatic identification and weld path generation, configurable weld reports can be generated for any assembly or for the entire project. So a lot of reporting capability built into the product. We really do have features for all stakeholders from beginning to end, from setting up everything through to warranty and traceability. We will cover or try to touch on all of these topics in these areas through the demonstration. I definitely want a integrated, connected environment, so it's all working within this area, and again, visually immersive. Really big part of our goals here is to create a comprehensive tool. And just for example, traditional report style looks more like this. It's a tabular table indicating your weld tags, weld standards, where, location, this kind of thing. Of course, we can generate this type of report, but we can also generate this kind of report where it's highly visual, where you can look in an area and see where your status of your welds are. So just as an example, we'll see more of that today in the demonstration portion. Just some basic use cases that we've addressed with this product. Weld estimation. The shipyards will be interested in that for various reasons. The design agencies, weld documentation, they require the reports, what to do. The quality reports, design agency and the shipyard. Management of the whole project. Production floor integration, shipyard and offshore project, just to name a few. So it really does cover the full gamut of what's needed in weld management and shipbuilding. In terms of product availability, weld management has been available since ShipConstructor 2012, although a lot of the features you'll see today, especially the more visual advanced ones, really are in the latest releases and the upcoming release as well, which will be out in the next few weeks. It's also either individual product or part of the suites, as you can see here. So I guess we're ready to hand over to you, Blair, if you like.
Okay.
Presenter. We'll be monitoring questions throughout the presentation. We'll try to minimize my interruptions, but hopefully we'll just periodically pause to deal with those. Thank you very much.
Okay, Norm. Okay, can you see my screen, Norm?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Blair Johnston, and for those that don't know me, I'm Technical Product Manager now at SSI. I've been here for about 8 years with the company, only the last about a year and a half now in the technical product manager, and as Norm mentioned, before that I did work in the development area. So I'm going to be with you today to take you on a bit of a test drive of the weld module, give you a little bit of a hands-on feel for how it looks and some of the things that it can do. So hopefully we'll go over a lot of the things that Norm sort of touched on in his introduction. So the basic outline of what we'll do today, we're going to look at setting up your project to work with welds. Then once we've got our project ready to go, then we'll look at the tools that we actually work with in managing the welds, generating welds, editing welds, and so forth. Then the production information, generating reports and assembly drawings, how we handle change in weld management as the project changes after initial weld design has been done, and then we'll look at a few workflows with Navisworks as well. So before I dive into the actual setup of the project, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an orientation for what the goal is when we're setting up our project. Our main objective is to set up our weld schedule, and this is where we outline the types of welds that can be assigned to given types of welds in our project based on a number of criteria, generally the location of the weld in the ship, as well as the types of members being welded and the size of those members. So in ShipConstructor, the weld types, as I said there, that we're assigning are actually called the weld standard. And this is where we build up a sequence of weld processes. So each weld standard is a type of weld applied either on one side or both sides, and there might be multiples of those as well. So that's what we're going to take a look at now. So starting in, the first one is weld types. We're going to sort of go backwards from that overview. ShipConstructor ships with 18 predefined weld processes. Each of those comes with a predefined weld symbol. These weld symbols are completely customizable. So if for any reason you need to modify these for local variations, or perhaps you're repurposing some of them, then you can simply go in, edit the standard drawing for the weld symbol. Save your drawing, and now you've updated the weld symbol. There's also a usage log available, so you can track which weld standards have included this weld process in it, and you can also export these weld symbols and import them into other projects as well. So once we have all our weld symbols, our weld types the way we want them, now we're ready to actually start building up the weld standards. So and these are the actual things that we'll be applying to our welds in the model. When we generate a weld, this is where we'll be saying, how do I want this weld to be done? So each weld standard, as I say, represents a sequence of weld processes. So when we look at some of the standards in here, I can see in this case I've got one process simply applied, a fillet weld applied to one side. If I go down, I can look at a couple that have more than one process, a bevel groove, a fillet weld. Also, you can see that for each weld standard there's a weld symbol. By default, ShipConstructor will actually compose this weld symbol for you. However, you can customize it as well. So you can go in there and make adjustments to the way that it looks. Some of the properties that are available for the weld standard are color. This is actually going to be quite important later on. We'll see that we have a set of colors that we know we can recognize and distinguish from one another. Later on in the demonstration, we'll see why this is important. Other things you can specify, tail notes. So again, ShipConstructor automatically includes these in the weld symbol for you, and you can specify the text size for those tail notes as well. When we're defining each of the processes in the weld standard, each process has a set of properties that apply to it as well. So we can actually specify for each weld, For example, in this fillet weld, is it intermittent, is it continuous, double continuous, and so forth. The material, the shape of the weld, so is it concave, convex, which side, arrow side, other side, and some other properties including the leg length, the pitch, segment length, and so forth. So these are all specified for each process in the weld standard. So now we have the set of weld standards that we're going to use in our project. So we're now actually ready to build the weld schedule, and this will be applied. This essentially tells us where all the welds we expect to use and where they will be applied. So as mentioned before, it's organized by a series of criteria: location, the types of members being welded, and the size of the members being welded. All these items are actually user definable, and they're editable in the weld schedule dialog itself. So we can open up, you can edit any of the locations, we can add new ones, we can also check for which welds, which schedule items use those locations. We also have the member type definitions, again, fully customizable, and the sizes. One of the ways we've also tried to organize the weld schedule in the catalog is going to be exactly the same when we're actually in the project and we've generated welds and we need to now assign the weld standard to those welds. We're actually going to pull up a version of this dialog and we'll be able to filter down and locate the welds that we want. So the idea is to try and make it familiar from both sides. So this was the primary goal. This was where we wanted to get to. Our project is pretty much now set up to be able to do welding. The one last item that we have in the catalog doesn't apply to the weld types, but actually to welds themselves. And this is weld status. And the weld status provides a basic workflow mechanism for welds within your project and also a way of tracking what their current status is. Similar to with the weld standards, the color that we use for the status is going to be important, and again we'll show this a little bit later on in the demonstration. And one of the other properties that we have for the weld status is one of them is marked as a default. And this, whichever one is marked the default, this will be, when we generate new welds, this will be the status that will be applied to it initially. So again, statuses can be exported and imported into other projects. I didn't cover this as well when I was in the weld schedule, but the weld schedule is actually exported and importable and can also be exported into Excel as well. So this is the project setup now for weld. Once we've done this, we're now actually ready to start working with welds in our project. The tools that we're going to use to work with welds are the Weld Manager and the Weld Management drawing. And these two tools work together. And before we go into looking at them a little bit further, I want to just give you a little bit of background in sort of how they work so that you'll understand a little bit better how I'm working with these two objects in the demonstration. In traditional ShipConstructor projects, areas, you create your parts in model drawings, you save those model drawings back to the marine information model, and then you generally create views of that marine information model of those parts, typically in production drawings or reports, possibly now through Publisher LT and so forth. With weld, the role of the model drawing in most other areas is now being played by the Weld Manager. So in fact, Weld Manager, go back here, that's the dialog on the side here. This is where we'll be actually generating our welds, creating our welds, and editing our welds. And then we'll be saving this information back to the central model, and then the Weld Management drawing acts as essentially a view of our welds in a drawing that is actually it's actually a ShipConstructor production drawing. That's because we're not actually editing parts in the drawing, it's a view of those welds. So you're going to see this sort of save and then update process that's familiar for working with production drawings as part of our working with the welds and the weld management drawing. So that said, unlike the traditional model drawings and production drawings, there is some synergy between the Weld Manager and the weld drawing. Weld Manager is where we'll be actually loading welds into, or sorry, assemblies into the weld drawing, and also selection between the two is synchronized. So if I select a weld in Weld Manager, then if that weld's in the weld management drawing that I'm looking at, then it will be selected in that in the drawing, and vice versa. If I select part in the drawing, it will be highlighted in the Weld Manager. So the Weld Manager is product hierarchy driven. We'll see this in a little bit. It's actually, this allows us to bring our welds into the product hierarchy process for planning purposes. This is where we'll be loading, we can locate and load assemblies into our drawing to say this is where we create and edit our welds, including the geometry. We assign our weld standards here. We can do this either individually or multiples, and there's also some tools for working with and locating welds in our drawings. So with that introduction, I think we're ready to go and actually generate some welds. So the first thing we're going to do is actually create a weld drawing. So we're going to start right from scratch. Now in normal production drawings in ShipConstructor, when you create a new drawing, you go through a wizard where you tell ShipConstructor what parts you want loaded into that drawing. For weld, because we're using it more as a view of the welds we're working with in Weld Manager, there is no wizard to load the parts into the drawing. We essentially have a copy of the template drawing, and then we use Weld Manager to load parts into the drawing. The template drawing for weld management is going to be similar to most other template drawings in ShipConstructor. You can set your drawing options there, and typical drawing options for weld, all the normal drawing options apply. For weld, two of the important ones that you'll be setting are the weld visualization, and this tells ShipConstructor how to color the welds. So back when we're setting colors for our weld standards and for our statuses, we can actually tell ShipConstructor, do I want to show my welds by the colors of the standard or by the colors of the status? And the other option that we may want to play with in our template drawing is there's an underscore parts layer. So these are layers. The two that Weld Management works with are underscore part and underscore weld. And obviously when we load assemblies into the drawing, they go onto the underscore part layer. And when we generate welds, those go into the weld layer. So we can see in this case my template was set to have a transparency of fairly high transparency for the part layer. This allows me to de-emphasize the parts and be able to focus more on the actual welds. So now for weld, the tools that I'm going to be using on the ribbon are under the Structure tab, and on the far right there are only two. It's the Weld Manager and the Update Drawing. An Update Drawing, in fact, is the exact same Update Drawing command that you'll find on the Production tab as well. So, and this goes back to our model where we create in the Weld Manager, save to the central model, and then update into our Weld Management drawing. So now I'm going to open the Weld Manager, and the first thing it does is go through and load the product hierarchy. So, as I mentioned before, the product hierarchy is, the Weld Manager is product hierarchy driven. So the control that you see on my left-hand side is pretty much the exact same product hierarchy you'll see in the actual product hierarchy dialog. And I can use find to locate assemblies, but the commands are actually customized for the Weld Manager. On the right-hand side of the Weld Manager, I have two grids. The top one is a set of connections, and what ShipConstructor does is when I generate welds, for an assembly, the first thing it does is go through and establish all the connections between the parts in that assembly. So any adjacent structure parts will result in a connection, and for each of those connections, I'm going to generate a weld. So now for this demo, I'm going to actually be using an assembly called P13. So I'm going to just do a search for that. So now that I've got my Weld Manager drawing open, I've got the Weld Manager open. Now I'm ready to actually load this assembly into my Weld Management drawing so that I can generate some welds. So all we do is click on the assembly, say load, and then ask ShipConstructor to go out to the model and load the parts from the database into the current drawing. And then once that's ready, then we can actually start building some welds. So now we see our assembly is just a simple panel with a few stiffeners on it. And so now I want to actually generate the welds to hold these stiffeners onto my plate. Before I do that, I'm going to go to the product hierarchy to do this, but one of the things I'm going to look at here before I start is, in the product hierarchy, we can see that there's an out-of-date symbol on this assembly. So that tells me one of two things. Either this assembly is out of date currently, which means one or more of the parts in that assembly has changed since I last worked with it, or in this case, I actually haven't yet generated any welds for this assembly. So to generate the welds, I'm going to go to, under the assembly, I'm going to select the assembly that I want to work with, and in the pop-up menu that shows up, there's a Generate Welds option. And it gives me two options here. I can generate welds for the direct assembly that I selected, or I can also include sub-assemblies as well. In this case, the assembly that I'm working with is in fact a leaf assembly, so it doesn't really matter which I choose. So I say generate weld information. So now what's happening is, as I mentioned earlier, ShipConstructor is now going out and examining this assembly and looking for connections between structure parts. And these have been loaded into the top grid. So for each connection is showing me what assembly it supplies to and then what the two parts are that are being connected. Now, for each one that's selected, if I look down below, there's actually a weld now specified for each of these. And if I select all the connections, I can see all of the welds. And now for each of the welds, I actually have a number of properties set up. First of all, there's a weld tag, and this is generated by a naming convention. We see the status, which is the initial or the default status that we specified in the catalog has been applied to each of these welds. There's a weld standard, which is blank because we have yet assigned no weld standard. There's a note section, which we'll look at a little bit later. There's actually a fair number of properties that are available, and I'm not going to go through all of them. You'll notice a few of these, though, the location, the weld members, thickness, and so forth, those actually come from the weld schedule as well. So once we assign a weld standard to these welds, then that information will get filled out. So now, as I mentioned way back in the beginning when we were talking about the weld and production drawings, so I've generated my welds now in Weld Manager, but I have to now, they don't show up in the weld drawing yet. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to update the drawing. Now, I mentioned having to save. Most of the operations that I work with, I'll actually have to save before I can update. The actual generation and update of welds actually happens on the server. So the apply button's already grayed out here, which means that's already, there's nothing more to save. So now we can see I've got a bunch of new welds that are ready to come into my drawing. I update. And now we can see it's drawn welds between each of my parts in my assembly. Now, one of the properties it's way over here, is length. So for each of the welds that was generated, where to go? For each of the welds that is generated in the assembly, ShipConstructor calculates the geometry required for that weld and shows the length here. Now this already now gives me information that I can use for generating an initial estimates of my welds. So I can actually, I'll show you these buttons, mostly just because of my space on a single screen here, I'm going to work with this bit bunched up, but just to show you the buttons that I'm going to be working with are across the top here. And one of them is the TSV export. So I can actually export my weld information now, and I'll have all the information that's in the weld grid here, including the length of these welds. So if I have a multiplier that I can use to give me a ballpark figure for, just based on length, roughly how much resources I'm going to need, material, labor, etc., based on length, I can now get a ballpark figure of the welds for this assembly, and this applies up the scale to the larger and larger assemblies as well. So we're already starting now to get into some of the weld planning that's being brought in with the Weld Manager. So the next step in our workflow now is I should open up. I don't see any questions, I don't think, Norm. So I'm going to continue on. So the next stage in our workflow is, now we have our welds generated. Now we have to actually identify what type of weld each of those is. So, and as we mentioned before when we were setting up, this is done by assigning a weld standard to each of these welds. Now in my case, it's a very simple panel and all the welds are of the same type. So I'm just going to select all of my welds, and now I can assign them one at a time, but we've actually taken care to make it easier in many cases to be able to set up the project more quickly, to make it easier to do that. So we can actually go in and assign the standard. Now here we're bringing up the weld schedule again. So this is what we set up in the catalog earlier. Now I can filter down to the area that I'm looking for, so again by location. So my location here is internal deck and below, and the types that I'm going to be working with are watertight bulkhead to stiffener. And so I know I'm on this row here, and I'm going to be working with 11 millimeter stock. So I'm going to select this weld here. So it's now assigned the weld to each of these members, the weld standard, and it's also filled out the other remaining information from the weld schedule. Now if I wanted to, I can also select an individual one and assign those as well. So now I've got a different one. So this is the main process of actually detailing our welds in the project. And so now again, in terms of planning, once I get the weld standard applied to each of these welds, I can re-export this information again. I can open this up in Excel, and now I can group this by weld standard And this gives me now the information to build a much more detailed estimate of my welds, because I now know for each weld standard more detailed information about how long each weld is going to take based on length, the number of welds perhaps for overhead, so I can start estimating the more detailed costs as well as material. So giving me a lot more detailed information. Now, in my workflow, the next stage that probably I'm going to be looking at is I'm going to want somebody to actually go and take a look, do some checking of my welds. And so what they're going to want to do is take a look at my assembly and then sort of analyze, did I assign the right welds? And one of the really powerful tools that we've tried to build in to make this information easily accessible to people doing this kind of thing is to be able to visualize our weld by the weld status, by the weld type. So when I assigned the weld standard to my drawing, we haven't saved this information yet back to the model, and so this information isn't yet reflected in the drawing. If I select the weld part and look at its properties, we can look, there's no weld standard assigned yet to our weld. So what we're going to do is we're going to save this information and we're going to update our weld drawing. So we can see we've got a number of modified welds in the drawing now. As soon as I do that, we notice that the welds have changed color. So in my template, I mentioned earlier that in the template drawing, one of the properties that I'll be setting is the weld colorization. And my template is set up to color the welds by weld type, by weld standard, And so once that information is available on the weld, now the color that's assigned to each weld in the catalog is now used to draw the welds in my drawing. So if I'm going in and checking the drawing, I know roughly what I'm looking at. I know this is a panel, and I know I've got a bunch of stiffeners on that panel, so I know what kind of weld to expect in most cases for this panel. So I can see at a glance, I can look and see, well, there's something odd here. I don't understand why would that be there. Now, maybe there's a good reason for it, maybe not. But in that case, I can take a look and see, okay, take a look at the properties, what was the weld information, so I can see, okay, the weld standard that's applied, there might be a note specified for the person doing the modeling to communicate why that weld was put there, and I can see that the status was modeled as well. So once I've done that, then done my checking, now I actually want to indicate somehow that I've completed that task and report the results back. So this is where we're going to start working with the weld status. I'm just looking at one of the questions, and one of the questions is, are weld dimensions, the leg length, the fillet size, etc., also visualized? Dan, no, they're not. What we're looking at here is a generic visualization of the weld, so we're not taking account the shape or any of those types of things. One of the options in the drawing options for weld allows you to specify the diameter of the weld, but currently it's just a generic cylinder essentially used to represent the weld. And yes, you're welcome, Dan. And I got a request to zoom in to SO2. I'm not sure what you're, oh, I see. So, yeah, so it's a request to zoom into SO2, SO4. So I'm not sure what you're wanting to look at here, but so you're looking down in the welds down here. We'll just take a closer look at some of the welds generated. So I'm not sure if that's answering the question for the zoom, if that's giving you what you were looking for. So now, so going back to my workflow, so where I was in the process of a checker, now taking a look, reviewing my drawing and trying to provide information back in terms of what the results are of the checking. So in this case, what I want to do is I'm going to indicate that all of these welds have passed except for the one that I noted that there's something wrong with. So again, in the interest of trying to speed up the editing of the fields, we've actually provided the ability to select all the welds and specify. We can go into the properties dialog here, which allows us to set a given property across all selected welds. So in this case, it's the status that I'm going to want to modify, and I'm going to set this back to passed. So it's a very simple workflow that we'll be using. And now, taking advantage of the synchronization of selection, I'm going to just select the weld that I want to mark as failed, and now I can go and just set this one to failed. Oh, didn't mean to do that. Close the weld manager. So now what I've done is, so I just use, so what I've done now is I've indicated the information for, I've gone through, reviewed my welds, been able to go back and set the information for what the status is. So now I pass this information back in a workflow, and now someone who's coordinating this can either pass the information back to the original modeler to correct and then send back to the workflow and eventually get it corrected. So in this case, we're just going to go ahead and we'll do the shortcut and set it back to what we think it should be. Oh, I'm going to check set the status back. We're going to assume it's gone back to be rechecked and so forth, and update our status. Okay, so now we can see all the welds have now all the same type. So we've got our weld, we've passed the checking process, and we're ready to actually put the assembly together and have the welding done on the shop floor. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the process because ordinarily we'd have drawings associated with this as well, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but I'm going to jump into something related to the weld manager. And this is, some clients actually include lists of the welds in a spreadsheet to go along with the work package to go out to the shop. And this information is used to track things like what has happened to the weld, whether it passed inspection, and so forth, who worked on the weld. In order to make this process simpler, ShipConstructor Weld has built in the ability to export the welds into Excel automatically, have information in that spreadsheet updated, and then use that to import back into ShipConstructor, updating some of the status information. So we'll take a look at this. So what we're going to do, we're going to build our spreadsheet to send out on our work package. So we're going to go and select all our welds. And now I'm going to do a TSV export. So I'm just saving that out on my desktop. And I'm going to go and, I'm going to have to do that manually. Oh, actually, I'm not sure where I sent that file, so let me do that again. That looks to be there. Okay, sorry about that. I'm not sure where I'm setting the file. Okay, let's try that. Oh, right, sorry. So I've been given the clues to what I'm doing wrong here, and I was not changing the filter. Okay, there we go, sorry. My apologies for that. I did have my coffee. I don't know why that didn't help me. Okay, so now I'm opening my text file. What I need to do is tell Excel now just simply how to interpret the file that it's opening. So I have a delimited file. It does have header information in the file, and the tabs are being used as the delimiter. So that's all I need to, all Excel needs in order to open the file. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just expand all the columns, and this will allow me to see the column headers. And what we can see here is that I've got pretty much an exact replica of the weld grid from the Weld Manager. All the columns that are available in the Weld Manager show up in my spreadsheet. You'll notice some of these columns are delimited by pound signs. And those pound signs are indicators of columns that when I import this spreadsheet back into ShipConstructor, that value will get updated. So in my sort of work package now, we're sending this out to the weld, and in my little scenario, we're going to actually have our welder is going to be able to weld. He's actually been able to put the entire assembly together. It's relatively small, and he had the time in this particular day. So we're going to update the status to welded for all these. And then we're going to say that the next stage was for the assembly to go through inspection. And my person doing the inspection was able to get partway through this assembly today, but wasn't able to complete it. So some will have to be left for tomorrow. So we're going to say that some of these passed. And I'm going to pick one and just pick on one and say that for some reason this weld failed. And we'll say it's too small. So whoever did it didn't quite put enough material in, didn't do it correctly, so this one's failed. So now I can save this back to disk, and now I can go back to ShipConstructor, and I can now import my spreadsheet as a TSV file. So it's imported the welds. And now if we look, we see the status of all my welds have been updated to what was specified in the spreadsheet. And this is also brought in the notes. Now, as part of this process, now what I may want to do is, part of my daily, as a person now tracking the progress of my project, what I may want to do is be able to see, okay, how much of my project has been welded and what is the status of those welds. So in this case, now I'm looking at a small assembly here, but I might also work with a larger assembly. And what I want to do is actually change my ability to see the welds now by status. So we talked earlier before when the question was raised about the weld visualization, and this is the other option that we have, the diameter of the weld. So this is just simply setting the diameter of that cylinder. So the weld color, we're going to now change it set to standard. We're going to change it to status. And Now, again, in order to get my information back into my drawing, I've got to save it from the weld manager, update my weld drawing. I have a number of modified welds, and now we can see that the welds are now reflecting the status of the welds in the weld manager. So the sort of grayish white welds are showing these are passed. The green ones are indicating to me which ones have been welded but not yet inspected, and the red one is showing me, not surprisingly, the failed one. So now if I'm a person getting my assembly back in order to take a look at it for the purposes of, maybe I've got to find out, what went wrong, or maybe I'm trying to look at, okay, someone did this wrong, what was the issue with this weld, then I can actually just select my weld and it will now show up in the weld manager. Or if it's a more complicated assembly, then I can just simply select the connections, look at the welds, see the failed one, and now I can select the weld from in here. And if I need to locate a little bit more information, I can actually isolate just the structure parts now that are connected to the weld that I had selected. So everything else is hidden. And then when I'm ready, I can just turn on the display of everything else again. So I'm just looking at a couple of the questions here, and I've got a question: are the web and flange treated as different members in connection analysis? And I mean, Dennis, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe not. They're just considered as one. And could I set two different standards to a given connection? You can't, on a generated weld, you're assigning the weld standard to the weld path that you've defined, and the generated weld will encompass the entire weld path or the entire connection. We'll look a little bit later at generating a manual weld, and that's the mechanism that you would use to apply multiple weld standards to a weld. Actually, new question come in. How does the connection work for standard parts to regular parts? That's a good question, Matt. I don't know. Don't know if, Dennis, do you know an answer for that? So I didn't catch that, Dennis.
It pretty much works exactly the same.
Okay, okay. So, now I think we've pretty much covered the main part of working with welds. We've been able to we've gone through a number of workflows, generating the welds, going through some different scenarios in our workflows. The one last thing was just touched on in terms of being able to assign or create manual welds. And we'll just go through a simple process of how this works. What I was doing, I'll just work with a small one here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this generated weld with a manual weld. So I'm going to delete this in the weld manager. Save again, because I'm working with that model paradigm, I have to delete it from the weld manager. Save it and then update it back into the weld drawing. So remove part. So now my weld goes away. So to create a manual weld, it's fairly straightforward. All I need to do is, with my assembly loaded, I just say select assign weld path. Now what it's going to do is ask me to select two structure parts. It isolates them from everything else, and now it's giving me two options for specifying the path. I can either select an existing polyline for the weld path, or I can draw my own on the fly here, and I'm going to do a draw. So go in, and I'm just going to do a simple weld path here. So now we can see I've got a manually generated weld on my between these two structure parts, and now I can assign a weld standard to it. And you can also do this for if I assign multiple welds to that connection. So when we update welds later on, the manual welds will not be altered. So anything you've done with those will remain in place. So Weld Manager and the Weld Management drawing have done a lot of the heavy lifting for working with welds. We've done detailed modeling in terms of generating the welds. We've done production planning. This is by incorporating welds into the product hierarchy as well as generating estimates, preliminary and detailed for welds. Production documentation. We've started on this producing producing spreadsheets for inclusion into work packages. In terms of weld management, we're now able to visualize the status of welds in our drawing. We've also introduced some workflows to keep track of where welds are in our workflow and a mechanism for keeping that information current within the model. For inspections, we've also using tools such as visualization and status to keep communication and faster information in that process as well. And also the exchange of information via Excel, adding to the traceability and warranty requirements in your project. So now we're ready to move on to production information. And as with other areas of ShipConstructor, now we've got our information, our parts in our central model, and now we're able to generate some reports and assembly drawings. I should pause here maybe and just go open it up to Norm. Are there any questions you want to highlight before we move on?
No, you've answered everything pretty
Okay.
well as we're going along here.
Okay.
Good.
So as with other areas of ShipConstructor, we now have the parts in the model and we're able to generate reports and our production output. The report side of things is fairly straightforward. There's one report for the weld information, and it makes available all the information that we saw in the Weld Manager, all the properties. We try to make sure those are available everywhere that the welds show up to be consistent. So they're available in the property palette as well as properties available in the report. So we'll do a quick demo of one here. I've got one set up. It's a very straightforward report. My assembly is already ready to go. So we'll just generate the report. So this is working with the welds that we've taken a look at now. So this is one that's focused on tracking the status of the welds. So the welds are listed, grouped by status. I do have the length of each weld, so I could also have a report that generates by weld standard and grouped by weld standard and the length. So this also feeds into my weld planning if I want to know the length of each weld in that assembly, of each type of weld, sorry, in that assembly. So in terms of production information now and production drawings, yeah, Weld Manager, this is supported in the assembly drawing. So we're going to go and generate one of those. So I'm going to go to Navigator, create a new assembly. Now the main change in creating assembly drawings to work with welds is simply telling the wizard that we want to include welds in our drawing. And this is done in the first stage of the wizard. Right at the bottom here, there's a little checkbox called Include Welds. So I check that, and that's what allows me to bring the welds into my assembly drawing. So I have to drill down. I don't have a pre-select on this since it's a new drawing. So I'll drill down to our P13 assembly. give it a name. So now we're going through the standard sort of assembly drawing generation here, going out to the database, putting our assembling from our template, loading our BOMs and our layouts. So on the bottom I have just a general assembly layout, and then I have one designed around working with welds. So if I zoom in, first thing is there is a BOM collector that supports the weld information. And again, as with reports and other areas, all the properties that are available in the Weld Manager are available for the weld BOMs. So in this case, I've just called out some of the details of the weld, the standard, its tag, and so forth. And I've also, in this particular layout, I've put an off-page BOM based on the weld standard. And the way I've set this one up is, if we go into the viewport options, I've set this layout up so that I'm going to use not the weld identification BOM, only the weld standard BOM. Now in this case I only have one weld standard, but I may have others as well. And what this now does allows me to label all my welds according to the weld standard. So I just simply go auto label. So my one, so I do have one. This was this NA. This was the manual one that we didn't actually get around to assigning a standard to. And all the other ones, if I zoom in, have the weld standard label. The weld standard labeled for that part. And I'm just going to move it so that it's a little bit more, it's a little bit clearer what each of these arrows are. I won't do it for each one, but just a few for the demo purposes. So I've got my labels. I've started on the process of making them a little bit neater. And once this is done, now I'm maybe going to head off some questions here in terms of the labeling. I'm labeling only with text labels here, and the most common question I think I get at this stage is, do we support labeling by the weld symbols? Because we've certainly taken care to include those in the weld standards and the weld types that those are composed of. And the answer is not in this version of ShipConstructor. In 2015, we only support the text labeling. However, in the upcoming release of ShipConstructor, we will support labeling by the weld symbols. But for now, you have to do it by standard. So the next thing that I've done in setting up the template for this production drawing is to set up my layers so that my weld layer is set to not plot. And so what this allows me to do is, when I actually do go to plot my drawing, go into a preview. Now if I zoom in, it's not letting me zoom in anymore. My labels now point to just simply where that connection is, not to, I'm not cluttering the drawing with the actual weld visualization in that drawing. So that's one of the ways in which you can control the output of your assembly drawing and make it look like a traditional drawing. So I think that gives me, so that pretty much covers our weld production. So relatively straightforward in the terms of the documentation, traditional assembly drawings, and reporting mechanisms, and the reporting also feeds into our weld management as well, being able to track welds by status and being able to get information about, again, for weld estimation, weld length, and so forth, summaries by weld standard. Now, one of the things that's pretty much a constant in working on projects is that things change. So we've gone through and we've taken great care with our assembly to set up our welds. We've checked the welds, and so we've gone through that whole process. But it may happen that for some reason one of the structure parts underneath needs to change. So the question is now, how do we handle that in weld or accommodate it? So I'm going to go through a fairly sort of simple example just to show how that process would work. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to the structure drawing that contains the panel we've been working in. And once this loads up, we're going to make it's a fairly crude change that we're going to do to this. And the idea is just to make it really obvious how the welds are responding to the commands that we give. So what I'm going to do is I'm just simply going to take this stiffener and I'm going to flip it around to the other side. So I'll just work with this one. And now if we go, we can see that it's flipped over to the other side. So I'm going to save this. And I don't need this drawing anymore. And now we're going to go back to our weld drawing. So if we open this up, we'll zoom back out to where we were. We'll pull in our weld manager again so that we can work with our welds. So now obviously nothing yet has changed in our assembly. I'm actually going to change the transparency of the structure parts just because the transparency will interfere with seeing things moving from one side to the other. It won't be quite as obvious. So now we're going to update our drawing. So this will bring in the changes that we made, the last changes in our weld, as well as the structure changes. So we update our drawing. So now we can see the stiffeners now moved over to the other side. But the welds are still on the current side. So nothing has changed with those. So the process of actually bringing the welds up to date to match our structure, as with the generation of the welds, is fairly straightforward. So I'm going to select my assembly. This allows me to drill down into the product hierarchy very quickly. And now I can actually go and say update welds. And again, similar to when I generated the welds, I can control whether it's just by the assembly that I selected or whether I include sub-assemblies. And as before, in this case, it doesn't matter because I'm working with a leaf assembly. So I say update assemblies. Yes. So now we've gone back. Again, I'm going to have to update my drawing to get the changes into my weld drawing. So a number of modified parts and a couple of removed welds. So now if we look, all the welds that no longer required are gone, and my weld connection to the plate has moved over to the other side. Since there are no stiffeners on this side, the stiffener to stiffener welds have actually gone away. They've been deleted. So those were the ones that were removed. So that's the process of working with welds in the changing environment. So I'll just pause again. Norm, any questions you want to highlight?
No, we're doing.
Okay. So the last part now on our agenda is a couple of Navisworks workflows to work with welds. Before I put this away, I'm just going to change this back to my weld standard and save. I'm going to close this. So now I'm going to go to Navisworks, and I'm actually going to open my drawing. So this is the drawing that we just created. And once we bring this in, Yeah, so I'm just going to turn this off so that I can get the graphic. Okay, so now we see our assembly. If I set my So now I can look at my panel, and we can see the stiffener that we've moved to the other side, including the welds have come across. Now, one of the workflows that I might have is perhaps nightly, I regenerate a Navisworks model based on possibly the entire ship, or at least the unit that I'm working in. And this can enable a few different workflows for me. This, in terms of where before we were tracking things like our weld status information and our weld types in our weld drawing, we can now do this on a larger scale. So, for example, right now I'm looking at my weld types. Now, as I saved that drawing, it was back with the colorization of the welds based on weld standard. So I might use this for some walkthroughs, maybe for the work that was modeled during the day. I might just do some walkthroughs, not necessarily quite as focused, perhaps just walk through, take a look at the welds that have been done and sort of see, okay, do they look? And again, by color, now I can tell pretty quickly, is this sort of what I'm expecting in this place? And if something looks a little out of place, then I can now focus on it. So in this case, if I select a weld, something calls my attention, then I can actually select the weld in Navisworks, and again my weld properties are now brought over into Navisworks, so I can see the weld length, I can see the weld status, notes in this case from my failed weld, so what was wrong. I know the status and I know the type that was assigned, so I may already know the information that's needed there. One of the things that may help me in working with larger assemblies is predefined selection sets. So in this case, there's one already set up for me, and this is focused around the structure parts in the model. And so this allows me to, for example, if I was just looking at wanting to just see what welds are where in my drawing, I can actually hide all the structure and just take a look at the welds. This will be a little bit more useful when we go to the next stage, and that is the visualization of the weld progress. So early in the model drawings, we were looking at welds colored based on status. Now in this case, that drawing was not saved with weld status information, so I don't have that available to me in my Navisworks model. But what we can do is take advantage of another property in Navisworks called the appearance profiler. And the appearance profiler, if you're not familiar with it, allows me to specify a set of rules based on part type and properties of those parts, and then something to apply to the appearance of those, a rule to apply to the appearance of those parts. So again, we have something for the demo set up and ready to go. And this is designed around allowing me to visualize the welds in my model based on their status. Now, and these colors don't have to match what was set up in my project. If it's my own view of the model, I can have my own colorization, possibly giving me more information, or perhaps collapsing some down so I don't get it quite as noisy. It's my choice here. And we'll notice in this case I'm also setting transparency on the structure parts when I view this. So now all I have to do is run this set of rules, and now we can see all our welds according to the weld status and the colors that we've defined in this project. And the structure's now been de-emphasized, so I can look through parts of my assembly. If I've got enclosed areas, I don't necessarily have to go inside in order to see the welds. I can actually see them from the other side. Now, if my assembly is actually quite large, perhaps I'm looking at the entire unit and I just want to see sort of where is the weld for this entire unit. I'm not looking at details of what type of weld. I just want the sort of bigger picture of how this unit is looking like in terms of weld progress. Now I can use my selection set that I've set up previously and actually use this to hide some or all of my structure, and now I'll get just simply a visualization of all the welds in that unit by my SPI status, so I can see which ones have passed, which ones have been welded, which ones have not yet been welded, and I can watch that progress through the unit. So one last workflow that we have for the working with Navisworks, and this is a little technique that was brought to me not that long ago, and it's a facility that AutoCAD has an interaction between Navisworks and AutoCAD, and this is the switchback command in Navisworks. So if I go and I pick on a part and I go to the item tools in the ribbon, there's a command called switchback here. And what this allows me to do is from Navisworks go back to the source of that part in my Navisworks drawing. For this to work, I've got to set it up in AutoCAD, and there's a command NW load. And what this does is tells AutoCAD, or gets AutoCAD ready to listen to commands from Navisworks. And in that case, those commands will come from the switchback. So now if I go to AutoCAD, what it's actually done, you'll notice there were no drawings open in ShipConstructor. So Navisworks, the switchback, has actually sent the information to AutoCAD, said what drawing to open up, and you'll notice it actually even selected the part that I was working with. So that's one very convenient way of when you're sort of working with that bigger picture, whether you're doing a walkthrough, looking at the larger picture status information. If for any reason you need to drill down to the source of that part, very easy way to get to that information. So this sort of concludes the demo part of the webinar. Before I go up to any final questions, I just want to say thank you everyone for dropping by and taking a listen to the demo. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and that you'll be able to give it a try in the near future. So Norm, are there any other questions you want to go cover?
No, we're doing fine. It's good.
All right. Do you want to do the wrap up then?
Yes, you can hand it over to me. Be great.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Okay, Norm.
Okay. So just a couple of slides to finish up here. Some of the key takeaways we want to make sure I think you've captured. It's an integrated environment where all the information is leveraged and reused. There's many different ways to interact with it within ShipConstructor, AutoCAD, and Navisworks. Very intuitive, immersive visual experience. I think generated in a way that's very useful. The old picture's worth 1,000 words, and solves several real client challenges. So we did do a lot of consulting with real weld management experienced people in the shipbuilding industry, and the solution we have here is definitely designed around that type of workflow, all the practical aspects. We do encourage further discussion after this session, of course. We have the Algae Marine Forum, if you're not aware of it, started started just a couple of months ago, a few months ago, so I encourage you to sign up to that. That's not just a ShipConstructor thing, that's very much a marine industry, as well as your Nexus account if you want to submit questions privately. If you want to understand what licensing options are available for you or additional training programs coming up in this year, then contact your local dealer or representative depending on your region. And I'd like to just promote the next one. In January we have PipeLink. We'll be covering PipeLink, which is related to pipe and PCF and isometrics and isogen, and that will be January 21st. So if there are no further questions, we can wrap it up. I appreciate everybody's time, and I hope you found it informative. Thank you very much.